Everyone knows the Munsters as TV's most lovable monster family. But in 1965, one episode went too far. From illegal props to dangerous stunts, this is the story that almost ended the show. What happened that day was so shocking, the footage was locked away forever. Now, we're exposing the real reason this episode never made it to air and why the cast refused to talk about it for decades. The idea for the Munsters didn't start in the 1960s. It actually began in the 1940s, when animator Bob Clampett, famous for Looney Tunes, came up with a concept for a cartoon about a funny monster family. He worked on it for years, but it never took off. The idea just sat there, waiting for the right moment. That moment finally came in the early 1960s. Comedy writers Alan Burns and Chris Hayward, known for their work on Rocky and Bullwinkle, pitched a similar idea. They were inspired by Charles Addams's New Yorker cartoons, which featured a creepy but lovable family. But instead of creating something completely original, they turned to Universal Studios. Universal owned the rights to classic monsters like Frankenstein and Dracula. They saw an opportunity to bring these famous creatures into a sitcom. That decision shaped everything. Herman Munster became a Frankenstein-style father, with bolts on his neck and a clumsy but lovable personality. Grandpa turned into a comedic version of Count Dracula. The family lived in a giant, run-down mansion on a quiet suburban street. To them, they were just a normal family. To everyone else, they were terrifying. Writers Norm Liebman and Ed Haas took this concept and brought it to life. They wrote the first pilot, Love Thy Monster, which introduced the characters and the show's satirical tone. The Munsters weren't trying to be scary. They just wanted to live like any other American family. That was the heart of the comedy. The timing was perfect. In the early 1960s, classic monster movies were making a comeback. Universal had started re-releasing its old horror films, and audiences were falling in love with them all over again. The idea of mixing monsters with sitcom humor was exactly what TV needed. Universal Studios played a major role in shaping the show. Because they owned the classic monster designs, they could use them without any legal issues. This gave the show a unique look that felt connected to Hollywood's famous horror films. The studio also provided top-notch makeup and special effects. Bud Westmore, a legendary makeup artist, worked on the series. He made sure Herman, Grandpa, and the others looked like real movie monsters while still being expressive enough for comedy. Beyond the visuals, Universal's influence extended to the show's tone. Instead of making fun of horror movies, the Munsters celebrated them. Fans of classic monsters could enjoy the references, while general audiences could laugh at the family's everyday struggles. At its core, the Munsters was a satire of suburban life. The family saw themselves as completely normal. They had dinner together, went to work and school, and worried about everyday problems. But because of their monstrous appearances, they constantly confused and frightened their neighbors. The show played with this contrast in clever ways. The show also poked fun at traditional family sitcoms. In one episode, Lily encourages Herman to have a serious father-son talk with Eddie, just like dads in Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver. But Herman's advice is so ridiculous that the moment turns into a joke. The show played with these sitcom cliches in a way that was fresh and funny. Meanwhile, Fred Gwynne and Al Lewis didn't just play Herman and Grandpa Munster. They were the heart of the show. Their journey to the Munsters started years before, on a different sitcom called Car 54. Where Are You? They played mismatched New York police officers, and their chemistry was undeniable. Audiences loved them together. More importantly, they became close friends in real life. That bond carried over when the Munsters came along in early 1964. When casting began, producers knew right away who should play Herman and Grandpa. Gwynne and Lewis were the first ones chosen. Their friendship made the Munster family feel real. Transforming Gwynne into Herman wasn't easy. He wore heavy boots with 4-inch lifts and layers of padding. In total, his costume added 40 to 50 extra pounds. The heat from the studio lights made things worse. He once lost 10 pounds in a single day of filming. Despite all that, he gave every scene his best. His deep voice, goofy laugh, and childlike charm turned Herman into one of the most unforgettable TV characters of all time. Off-screen, he and Lewis stayed close, long after the show ended. Their friendship was just as strong as what fans saw on television. Not every casting decision was so simple. Originally, the Munster matriarch was named Phoebe, and she was played by Joan Marshall. But there was a problem. She looked too much like Morticia Addams from The Addams Family, a competing show that was about to air. Executives worried audiences would mix up the two series, so they decided to make a change. They scrapped the character of Phoebe and replaced her with Lily Munster. That meant finding a new actress, and they chose Yvonne De Carlo. De Carlo was famous for dramatic roles. She had starred in The Ten Commandments and other serious films. Fred Gwynne and Al Lewis weren't happy at first. They weren't sure she could handle the comedy, but De Carlo proved them wrong. She was given one simple direction: play Lily like a classic 1950s housewife, just with a gothic twist. She understood exactly what to do. Her elegance and charm balanced out Herman's goofy nature. Within no time, she became an essential part of the Munster family. Butch Patrick, who played Eddie Munster, wasn't the first actor cast in the role. In the original unaired pilot, Eddie was played by Nate Happy Derman. That version of Eddie was a bratty troublemaker. It didn't fit with the show's light-hearted feel, so they made a change. When Patrick stepped in, he gave Eddie a more lovable personality. He was mischievous, but never mean. That made him more relatable to young viewers, which helped the show connect with families. For Patrick, the Munsters was more than just a job. It was a huge part of his childhood. Working with Gwynne and Lewis taught him important lessons about acting. He has spoken fondly about those years, remembering how much fun it was to be on set. Even after the show ended, he carried those memories with him. The role of Marilyn Munster also changed early on. At first, she was played by Beverly Owen, but she left after 13 episodes. She had never wanted to take the role in the first place. She had been tricked into signing a contract and felt miserable on set. Sometimes, she even left in tears. Eventually, she found a way to break her contract, and producers had to find a replacement. That's when Pat Priest stepped in. Priest fit in perfectly. Marilyn was the only Munster who looked like a typical young woman, but she never saw her family as strange. To her, they were completely normal. That contrast made for some great comedic moments. Her presence also helped balance the show, giving viewers someone to relate to. Over time, Priest built strong connections with her co-stars, and her version of Marilyn became just as memorable as the rest of the Munsters. Meanwhile, the Munster house at 1313 Mockingbird Lane wasn't just a setting. It was a character in its own right. The house looked like something straight out of an old horror film, but it had a charm that made it feel like a real home. Its design took inspiration from Victorian-era mansions, especially the ones in San Francisco, but it had a darker, spookier look to match the Munsters' monster heritage. The exterior of the house was actually a combination of a real building and a Hollywood set. Universal Studios had a backlot house that was modified to become the Munsters' home. The interior was built on a soundstage, where every detail was carefully designed. The grand staircase, the dusty chandeliers, and the basement laboratory all played a role in the show's humor. The house had secret passages and hidden rooms that often became part of the story. Sometimes Herman would accidentally smash through a wall. Other times, Grandpa's experiments would go horribly wrong in the basement. The show's connection to Universal's classic horror films was obvious. Many details in the house were inspired by movies like Frankenstein and Dracula. The influence of these films made the house feel like a perfect mix of spooky and silly. It looked haunted, but it was never actually scary. The behind-the-scenes work on the Munsters was just as challenging as what appeared on screen. The cast had to deal with long makeup sessions, heavy costumes, and the difficulty of performing under hot lights. Fred Gwynne's costume made filming especially tough. The weight of his boots and the layers of padding made even simple movements a struggle. Yvonne De Carlo's dresses, while beautiful, were difficult to move in. One of the wildest pieces of Munsters history is the Drag ULA, a car that looks like something straight out of a Halloween fever dream. It was built from an actual fiberglass coffin. The idea came from the 1965 episode Hot Rod Herman, where Grandpa Munster needed to build a dragster to win back the family's other car. But getting the coffin wasn't easy. At the time, California law made it illegal to sell one without a death certificate. Richard Corky Corkes, who worked with the car's designer George Barris, had to be sneaky. He found a funeral home that was willing to make a deal. They left the coffin outside the back door at night, no questions asked. Once they had it, the rest of the car came together fast. A 189 cubic-inch Ford V8 engine gave it 350 horsepower. The exhaust pipes looked like a church organ. The back tires were huge Firestone racing slicks. The front wheels were tiny and came from an old buggy. Each hubcap had a silver spider, just to make it extra creepy. The car appeared in the movie Munster Go Home, and at least 5 versions were built over the years. Some ended up in museums, others landed in private collections. And then there was the Munster coach. If Dragulay was built for speed, the Munster coach was built for style. George Barris, the same man who designed the 1960s Batmobile, created this one too. He used 3 1926 Model T bodies and stretched them over a 1927 touring car chassis. The Munster coach became just as famous as the show itself. It appeared at parades, exhibitions, and even ended up in private collections. Behind the scenes, the cast had their own struggles. Al Lewis, who played Grandpa Munster, had to deal with a problem no one expected: his prosthetic nose. At first, the nose was much longer than the one most fans remember, but there was an issue. Every time he drank coffee, the nose got wet, turned soggy, and lost its shape. It became such a hassle that the makeup team finally shortened it. The unaired pilot of the Munsters was called My Fair Munster, and it played a big role in shaping the show. It was filmed in late 1963 as a way to sell the series to networks. This early version was different from what eventually made it to air, but it helped set the foundation. One of the biggest surprises was that it was shot in color. At the time, TV was moving toward more colorful productions, so it made sense. But that changed when the show was officially picked up. Filming in black and white not only saved money, but also gave the series a classic horror feel, making it look like the old monster movies Universal was known for. The pilot was filmed on Universal's backlot, using the same suburban street seen in Leave It to Beaver. That was part of the joke. The Munsters were supposed to be just another ordinary family, but they lived in a haunted-looking house with a pet dragon. The contrast made everything funnier. The script was written by Norm Liebman and Ed Haas, and Norman Abbott directed. This early version had all the right pieces, but a few things needed to change before the show was ready for television. One of the biggest differences was the casting. In the pilot, Joan Marshall played Phoebe Munster. This character was later renamed Lily and played by Yvonne DiCarlo. Phoebe looked and acted a lot like Morticia from the Addams Family, which made the producers rethink the role. They wanted Lily to be spooky, but also warm and motherly. Changing the actress helped strike that balance. Eddie Munster was also different. He was played by Nate Derman, and his version of Eddie was far more aggressive. He snarled, acted wild, and had a mean streak that made him seem less like a mischievous kid and more like an actual monster. When the show moved forward, the producers replaced him with Butch Patrick, who made Eddie more playful and relatable. He was still a werewolf boy, but now he felt like a real sitcom kid rather than a creature from a horror movie. Herman and Grandpa Munster stayed the same. Fred Gwynne and Al Lewis were already cast in the pilot, and their characters were pretty much set. However, Herman was played a little differently. He wasn't as goofy or lovable yet. In this version, he was more serious and had a deeper voice, making him seem more like a classic Frankenstein monster than a clumsy but kind-hearted dad. That changed when the show was picked up. They softened his personality, making him funnier and more charming. The tone of the pilot also felt different. The humor was there, but it leaned more into horror. Even the music was changed. The theme song in the pilot had a surf rock feel, which gave it a playful energy, but it didn't quite match the spooky tone of the show. The final version had a brass-heavy theme that became one of the most recognizable TV songs of all time. Despite its differences, the pilot did what it needed to do. It helped Universal Studios pitch the Munsters to networks, showing how horror and comedy could mix in a family sitcom. CBS liked the idea, but wanted some changes. They asked for different casting, a black and white format, and a shift toward comedy. These adjustments made the Munsters a huge success. Today, the unaired pilot is available on DVD, allowing fans to see how the show evolved. It's a rare glimpse at an early version of something that became iconic. The Munsters wasn't just a funny show about a monster family. It had something to say. Beneath the jokes and slapstick, it tackled big ideas about acceptance and what it means to be different. The Munsters looked scary, but they were kind, loving, and completely normal in their own eyes. The world around them, however, didn't always see it that way. One episode that captured this perfectly was Operation Herman, which aired in 1965. alive. Eddie Munster had a tonsillectomy and was resting in the hospital. Herman, being the devoted father he was, wanted to see him. The problem was that his towering figure and Frankenstein-like face made sneaking in nearly impossible. What followed was classic Munsters humor, misunderstandings, slapstick, and a hospital staff convinced Herman was a patient who had wandered off. But there was more to the episode than silly gags. At one point, Lily suggests Herman have a heart-to-heart talk with Eddie. It was the kind of moment that often happened in family sitcoms of the time. Lily even referenced Father Knows Best, a show known for its perfect all-American family. Herman, in his usual clueless but lovable way, replied that such talks were usually handled by Donna Reed on The Donna Reed Show. It was a small joke, but it showed how the Munsters saw itself. It wasn't trying to be the perfect, polished sitcom. It was something else, something that understood what it was like to feel out of place. This theme showed up in many episodes. In My Fair Munster, a neighbor complains that the neighborhood was nice until the Munsters moved in. The line was played for laughs, but it reflected a real issue in the 1960s. Many families faced discrimination simply for being different. Another episode, Munster Masquerade, took the idea even further. Marilyn Munster, the only normal-looking family member, had a boyfriend. His parents were excited to meet her until they saw her family. The moment they realized Marilyn came from a house full of monsters, they wanted nothing to do with her. The joke worked because it flipped expectations. Marilyn was the odd one out in her family, but to the outside world, she was the only one who belonged. The message was clear. People judge others based on appearances, and sometimes those judgments are unfair. One of the most powerful moments in the entire series came in Eddie's nickname. Eddie was feeling insecure, and Herman sat him down for a talk. What he told him became one of the show's most memorable speeches. The lesson I want you to learn is that it doesn't matter what you look like, whether you are tall or short, or fat or thin, or ugly or handsome like your father, or you can be black or yellow or white. It doesn't matter. What matters is the size of your heart and the strength of your character. For a lighthearted sitcom, this was a bold moment. It wasn't hidden behind humor. It wasn't softened by a joke. It was direct. It was honest. And it struck a chord with audiences. This was why the Munsters stood out. It wasn't just about monsters living in a normal world. It was about how people treat those who are different. It used humor to make a serious point, and it did it in a way that still feels relevant today. When the Munsters hit television screens on September 24, 1964, it was unlike anything audiences had seen before. A family sitcom, but with monsters. A Frankenstein-like father, a vampire mother, a werewolf son, and a grandfather straight out of a horror film. It was strange, but it worked. People loved the mix of comedy and classic monster tropes, and by the end of its first season, it had become one of the most popular shows on TV. It ranked number 18 in the Nielsen ratings, right alongside Gilligan's Island. Critics took notice too. In 1965, the show was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best TV Show, a rare honor for a comedy with such an unusual premise. Years later, it would receive multiple TV Land Award nominations, celebrating its lasting impact. One award in particular recognized the change in cast when Pat Priest replaced Beverly Owen as Marilyn Munster. Even with a major role being recast, the show remained strong. But no show stays on top forever. In January 1966, something new arrived on ABC. Batman burst onto the scene with bright colors, action-packed episodes, and a campy sense of fun that instantly hooked audiences. People who once tuned in for the Munsters now had their eyes on Gotham City. The ratings for the Munsters started to sink. By the end of its second season, it had dropped all the way to number 61 in the rankings. The network saw the numbers and made the call. In May 1966, The Munsters was canceled. The legacy of The Munsters goes far beyond its original run in the 1960s. Over the years, spin-offs, films, and reboots have kept the characters alive, proving that the spooky yet wholesome charm of the Munster family never really fades. One of the most notable follow-ups was The Munsters Today, which aired from 1988 to 1991. This sequel series took an interesting approach. Instead of continuing directly from the original, it explained that Grandpa had accidentally put the family into a deep sleep for 22 years. When they finally woke up, they found themselves in the late 1980s, trying to adjust to a new era. With Lee Merriweather as Lily, Jason Marsden as Eddie, and Howard Morton as Grandpa, the show managed to outlast the original series, running for 73 episodes. episodes. The first full-length Munsters movie came much earlier, in 1966. Just as the original show was ending, Munster Go Home hit theaters. This was the first time audiences saw the Munsters in color, which made their eerie yet endearing appearances even more striking. The film's plot had Herman inheriting a British manor, leading to a wild adventure in England, complete with scheming relatives, a hidden treasure, and a drag race. It kept the spirit of the series intact, with Fred Gwynne, Yvonne De Carlo, and Al Lewis reprising their roles as Herman, Lily, and Grandpa. Attempts to revive the franchise continued with several made-for-TV movies. The Munsters' Revenge, 1981, reunited most of the original cast, but it didn't spark enough interest to bring the show back. In the 1990s, two more TV movies with new actors tried to recapture the magic, but none had a lasting impact. Reboots, on the other hand, have been a different story. Many have tried to bring the Munsters back, but few have succeeded. In 2012, NBC produced Mockingbird Lane, a darker, more dramatic take on the series, directed by Bryan Singer and starring Jerry O'Connell as Herman. Despite its high production values, it never moved beyond the pilot episode. In 2017, there was an attempt to relocate the Munsters to hipster Brooklyn, but that idea was quickly abandoned. The most recent effort came in 2022, when filmmaker Rob Zombie took a stab at reviving the Munsters with a feature film. Unlike past attempts, Zombie's version leaned heavily into campy humor and a colorful, exaggerated style. Starring Jeff Daniel Phillips as Herman, Sherry Moon Zombie as Lily, and Daniel Roebuck as Grandpa, the film divided audiences. Some fans appreciated its nostalgic approach, while others felt the story was lacking. Still, its release on Netflix kept the Munsters in the public eye, proving that the family still has a place in pop culture. That influence can be seen across TV, music, and movies. Shows like The Simpsons have paid tribute to the Munsters multiple times, especially in their Treehouse of Horror episodes. The character of Eddie Munson in Stranger Things was partly inspired by Eddie Munster, highlighting how deeply the show has embedded itself in pop culture. Even the show's iconic theme song has been covered by multiple artists over the years, showing just how recognizable it remains. But it's the characters that truly make the Munsters unforgettable. Herman Munster, played originally by Fred Gwynne, became a symbol of the show's humor and heart. Despite his Frankenstein-like appearance, he was a kind and goofy father figure, proving that even monsters can be lovable. His deep, booming laugh and childlike enthusiasm have been parodied and imitated in countless shows and films. Grandpa Munster, played by Al Lewis, brought another layer of comedy. As an eccentric vampire with a knack for wild experiments, he was always cooking up trouble in his basement lab. His mischievous personality and old-school Dracula charm made him one of the most beloved characters, and his influence can be seen in other comedic takes on vampires over the years. The impact of the Munsters reaches beyond just nostalgia. It helped shape sitcoms that blend comedy with the supernatural. Its success paralleled that of The Addams Family, which aired around the same time. Though the two shows had very different tones, The Munsters was more lighthearted, while The Addams Family leaned into dark humor. That mix of horror and comedy influenced later shows like What We Do in the Shadows, which balances vampire lore with absurd humor, and even Stranger Things, which mixes supernatural elements with heartfelt family dynamics. At its core, The Munsters wasn't just a gimmick about monsters living in suburbia, it was a satire of the ideal American family, flipping the script by making its monstrous characters the most wholesome part of the show. Decades later, that charm still holds up, proving that even in a world of modern sitcoms and high-budget reboots, the simple magic of the Munsters remains timeless.